interested in news media and digital platforms and the role of competition law. So I want to start by asking, how does competition law deal with news? In the time before the News Media Bargaining Code, developed by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission and legislated earlier this year, I'd have said, not very well. But things have changed for the better in competition law's treatment of news. I support the bargaining code, but I think it's important we try to anticipate the limits of competition law in addressing social objectives that might not sit easily with the enhancement of markets. To do this, we need to acknowledge why competition law has not, at least in the past, dealt well with news. Economics gives us the very useful understanding of news as a public good, and the background note cites Ali's characterisation of public interest journalism in particular as a merit good. This is also a useful concept, bringing with it that normative impulse that society needs this form of news, and we should find ways of supporting it that are unconnected with its profitability. That said, a healthy news media environment requires a viable commercial sector, as well as a publicly funded media and other not-for-profit models. While no single policy is likely to achieve this, Australia's bargaining code is certainly our most important development in years. One of the great breakthroughs of the ACCC's digital platforms inquiry was seeing our most senior politicians acknowledge the importance of news, and especially public interest journalism. Suddenly, much of the country was looking at graphs showing the year-on-year growth in advertising revenue for digital media, and especially digital platforms, alongside the dramatic decline in advertising revenue for print media, where many of our journalists were housed. But before the news code, what had competition law actually done for news? It's my contention that in moments when it really counts, in mergers that can increase media concentration and harm media diversity, competition law often fails the public interest. The reason for this, at least in Australia, is that it usually applies the substantial lessening of competition test. Many scholars, regulators, and even parliamentarians have acknowledged that democratic societies want consideration of more than just competition effects. In 2014, the UK House of Lords Select Committee on Communications asked, would it matter if there were no policy on media plurality, such that decisions on media ownership were made strictly on competition grounds? They said, our emphatic answer is yes. There is a fundamental difference between the interests of competition and the consumer on the one hand, and the interests of the citizen and media plurality on the other. In matters of media concentration, both need to be considered. Now, I know it's unfair to expect competition law to carry the full weight of public accountability for media diversity. Sector-specific rules can be designed specifically to address diversity concerns, even if Australia is not alone in removing cross-media ownership rules, and our two remaining rules have very limited application. Also, the decision of the New Zealand Commerce Commission, upheld twice on appeal, shows how competition law with the right text can embrace other aspects of the public interest, such as levels of news coverage and the coverage of a variety of perspectives. But this is unusual, and the Commerce Commission arrived at this point through the application of a public benefit test. That test allowed for a more sophisticated consideration of the concept of quality in the news environment. This is something I think competition law generally does not do well, and it might be why dealing with misinformation and disinformation doesn't seem to be a good fit. Nevertheless, in Australia, the substantial lessening of competition test permitted the merger in 2018 of Nine Entertainment and Fairfax Media to create a group with very significant holdings in print and online media, commercial television, commercial radio, and video streaming. And we face the dominance of News Corp, eyeing commercial television to add to its print and online news, pay TV, and various streaming services. In early 2020, 5 of the top 10 news websites in Australia were owned by these two companies. So how did we come to address platform power before doing something about news pluralism? Well, we refocused. We looked away from mergers and towards power, that aspect that governments, at least in Australia, usually like to avoid. The ACCC started by recognising that the market power of Google and Facebook in the markets for search and social media and their accompanying advertising markets, recognising that they have market power. It found also that they had significant bargaining power in news referrals. The ACCC presented the evidence that proved platforms are unavoidable trading partners for news organisations. These findings are in themselves important developments. The legislation that developed out of these findings was even more important because it helped to reshape the bargaining position for some of the most important suppliers of news and current affairs content. Mandatory bargaining under threat of final arbitration reset news platform relations. Of course, the Australian scheme is designed in a way that these formal mechanisms might never actually be activated. They're dependent upon a government decision to trigger them. That will depend on whether a government minister exercising a discretion under the legislation decides that the agreements amount to a significant contribution to the sustainability of the Australian news industry. Unlike some of my colleagues, I won't be too concerned if the legislation itself is never triggered. But I am interested in what does not happen in this environment. Last week, Australia's Communications Minister reported that to date, Google has signed 14 commercial agreements with news organisations and Facebook has signed 11. They are said to be worth a lot, especially to some organisations. That's all good, and yet there's a hesitancy in my support for the bargaining code. The scheme rests on the assumption that platforms get more value out of publishers' content than publishers get out of referrals to their own sites. None of us knows whether that's correct. It might well be, but there's no method for working it out. Now, maybe I'm worrying unnecessarily, and I do get the reasons for a form of regulatory intervention that doesn't attempt to set a price, leaving it to market participants to decide. On stage at the News Media Bargaining Show, the code is the set, not the script. Everyone must be present by the half-hour call, and no one can leave early. But here's what worries me. First, the news sector is bigger than what those 14 plus 11 deals would suggest. Our media regulator has registered local news providers that are not being offered deals by Google and Facebook. This could result in a boost to the larger players, something good, at the expense of the smaller players, not so good. On the other hand, the media regulator has, quite correctly, given the rules of the scheme, registered the news sections of some urban cool websites that should not, in my opinion, be the subject of regulatory intervention, redirecting revenue from one sector to another. So it's looking like the code might not support news organisations that are critical to a pluralistic media environment. Still, that's something that could be fixed by tweaks to the legislation as part of a review. The review might also impose some requirement that the revenue goes to the production of journalism, or at least some transparency around where the funds obtained from this public intervention are used. My second concern is that these deals won't be enough to sustain a business model that is fundamentally flawed as a result of others, Seek and Craigslist, as well as Google and Facebook, developing new and better forms of advertising. If it comes to the crunch and platforms remove news, the conceptual underpinning of the bargaining code disappears because there's nothing to bargain over. Maybe the loss of news referrals will be made up in direct traffic to publishers' sites and apps. I know the ACCC has accounted for this, and its research was thorough and it consulted very widely. So again, perhaps I'm worrying unnecessarily. And the thoroughness of the ACCC's investigation was part of the reason I support the code, despite these concerns I'm sharing with you. But there's one final matter I'd like to raise. Because it's enacted through competition law, the bargaining code doesn't fundamentally alter the frame of reference for digital platforms. It does not say, these are the social responsibilities that we expect from you as a result of your participation in this market. In contrast, we do seem to be getting to that point in Australia and elsewhere with privacy protection and with mechanisms to address online harms and to some extent misinformation and disinformation. The community is saying, no, respect for privacy is an important shared value. Digital platforms need to adjust their business practices, and these solutions are not based in competition law. This brings me back to media pluralism and the observation that competition law does not have a good record for how it treats news in the context of mergers. In my view, the News Media Bargaining Code is a patch to a problem. There's a hole in the bicycle tyre, a glitch in the software, Our solution is working well for some users, but it's still a patch. Instead of competition law addressing the imbalance between individual commercial participants, I'd prefer to see a communications-based regulatory model in the long term that characterises digital platforms as service providers. These service providers would have obligations to the industry and the community in the way that, for example, telecommunications companies contribute to the provision of universal service. In closing, I'd say that's my principled side speaking. My pragmatic side says the ACCC has succeeded where many thought it would not. It's achieved results here and now, not far off in the future. So I'll thank them and take it as an early victory.